Hello, welcome to part 11 in my Nagging Thoughts series on theological sexism, where I'm doing a compare and contrast between Christianity and Islam as it relates to various topics that impact marriage. And this week I'm doing the contrast portion of what both worldviews have to say theologically on the issue of head coverings. So before we get into it, I want to take a brief moment, ask you to please like, subscribe, share, and above all, please do comment. I very much enjoy reading what your nagging thoughts are in response to all of this. So let's get into it. In episode 3 of this series, I did the compare portion on this topic to show what these two very different worldviews have in common when it comes to theology related to head coverings, namely that they both allegedly command women to cover their heads to symbolize their submission to men or the preeminence of male headship or masculinity. And this is why we typically only observe Muslim females starting to cover their heads once they're considered eligible for marriage, which, thanks to the example set by Muhammad in his marriage to Aisha, can be as young as age 6. It's also why we typically only observe Christian women covering their heads during a wedding ceremony. And I'm going to put links to everything that I am citing in the description below. So I don't ever want anybody to take my word for anything. Look it up for yourself. So I'll provide all the sources. And in this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to contrast how Christianity and Islam are different. Okay. And that is a very daunting task for me to contrast these two worldviews because, frankly, Christianity has done a very poor job of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ when it comes to passages that address women. Tradition typically functionally uses a Luke 22:24 interpretive lens, which is a verse that is asking which among us is the greatest when we approach topics like this. And what should be happening is that we as Christians are consistently approaching the Bible with a John 5:39 interpretive lens, asking ourselves, what does this passage teach us, or what does it say about Jesus Christ? And that should be our interpretive lens as we approach scripture. So let me begin by saying that I agree with the very high profile complementarian John MacArthur that in this point that 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 1 through 16 is written to refute local head covering customs that were peculiar to the church in Corinth and the cultural significance of what those fashion trends represented to the people at that time. That's the extent that I agree with him, because I do not agree with him that the takeaway point here of the passage is the preeminence of the masculinity in a divinely appointed gender hierarchy before God within the body of Christ. And in fact, I conclude that the point of this passage is a call to not practice a culturally acceptable tradition that exalts a supposed categorical spiritual authority of a particular gender with fashion. This principle of having nothing to do with idolatry, even if it's in just appearances, is what I see as holding true for all believers in all times, and not the fashion accessory rules and which gender it applies to themselves. And you can get more detail of the historical context in my clapback series entitled Does the Bible Permit a Woman to Preach by John MacArthur, and grace to you. And again, the link will be in the description below. But to summarize, in ancient pagan worship, women were believed to have a spiritual and or moral superiority because of a quote-unquote woman's intuition, which is a knowledge that comes from within. This is laying the foundation for Gnostic logic and what the Bible calls so-called knowledge, which was grounded in a woman's ability to birth life. That's where she was more connected, and, we should, trust her gut because she gives life. So somehow she has some kind of knowledge and insight that, men simply don't have access to. That's the thinking there, the logic. So here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is undoing that type of gender preeminence idolatry by pointing to the fact that not only did the first woman come from man, and we see that in verses 3 and 8 of this chapter, but that neither gender is independent of the other. And we see that very clearly in verse 12. So the takeaway point here is that only God is categorically superior, and he alone is to be worshiped and exalted within the body of Christ. But let's take a closer look at the context of biblical head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 through 16. And we clearly see in verse 5 that it is in the context of corporate worship and a woman's apparel as she approaches God on behalf of the congregation as she leads corporate prayer, as well as if she is speaking on behalf of God by publicly prophesying to the congregation. So even though the traditions of men have largely relegated the Christian practice of wearing a veil to a wedding ceremony so that the veil more clearly symbolizes a wife's submission to her husband's physical preeminence in the creation order and his supposed spiritual authority over her, the biblical text actually says that the purpose of a Christian woman's head covering is not a symbol of submission, but a symbol of power. This is a radical contrast from what coverings on women represent in Islam. But diving deeper into the Bible here, the original Greek word here is exousia. I don't speak Greek. I'm sure I'm butchering it. I'm not here to teach Greek. I'm here to show that a layperson can look these things up and verify the truth for themselves, which I encourage you to do so by checking the links in the description below. So the Greek word here is exousia, which is used by this very same author in this very same book, where it is accurately rendered as, quote, a right, or as, quote, power. And we see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 9, as well as chapter 9 verse 4, chapter 9 verse 12, and chapter 9 verse 18. But well-established tradition has flipped the meaning of this one word from meaning a right or a possession of power to being understood as submission to a power or an authority, but only where it is exclusively self-serving to the idolatry of male headship to do so. Namely, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 10, the passage we're talking about today. So this biblical passage says that when a Christian woman in Corinth wears a head covering, as she prays and prophesies within that church, it functions like a spiritual crown that gives her the authority in the church in the same way that a royal crown gives authority to a king when he's addressing a nation. But for those who are accustomed to functionally worshiping male headship within the body of Christ, that likely sounds too much like female idolatry to your ears. So let's just trash that idea and let's assume that the God of the Bible is just like the Allah of the Quran, who commands women to cover their heads to show their submission to God by means of fashion that shows submission to the preeminence of male headship over women, or at least a husband's headship and authority over a wife. Even if we go with that interpretation, we still have a radical difference between Christian head coverings and Islamic coverings for women. Because not only does verse 2 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 make it plain that fashion rules that govern how Christian women should dress their heads at church, these things are not part of the fundamental traditions that verse 2 explicitly confirms were already passed down and being practiced prior to this issue being addressed. But this passage actually provides a culturally subjective workaround these fashion rules. Verse 6 makes it clear that a woman should cover her head in proportion to how widely society considers it shameful for a woman to either cut her hair or shave it off entirely. So as long as those two looks are acceptable, this passage says that it is not necessary for a devout Christian woman to put something on her head even if she's leading prayer or prophesying in front of the gathered church and angels are in attendance. I'm not even going to try to unpack that portion of this passage that references a connection between fashion and offending angels. But that is in this passage here. So I encourage you to look into that and tell me what your thoughts are. But moving on, the idea that it's not necessary for a Christian woman to wear a head covering in cultures where it's acceptable for her to cut her hair or to shave her hair. This is clarified and corroborated and confirmed by verse 16, which closes this portion of this topic by confirming that gendered head coverings are not something to quarrel about, since the churches of God have no such practices concerning head coverings. This is further corroborated because, again, we have a rendition translation issue here that kind of obscures the fact that that's what the Greek is saying, that there are no such practices. Some in English it says we have no other such practices, which might lead you to believe that this is the practice that all the other churches are practicing, but that's not actually what's in the Greek. And we can verify that it's not in the Greek by the fact that 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 9 makes it very clear that women's hairstyles were very visible within the church, which means that they were not wearing head coverings in the church of Ephesus. So at best, a Christian head covering is a symbol of power that a woman should wear to lead prayer and prophesy at church, but only if society considers it abhorrent for a woman to either cut or shave her hair. And at worst, it's a symbol of submission to the preeminence of male headship that, again, is only applicable if a woman is praying and prophesying at church, which could possibly be restricted even further to just married women who pray and prophesy at church, since the same Greek word is used for woman as it is for wife. I have the passage here, but I will let you guys read it just for the sake of time. So how does this worldview concerning head coverings, how does this theology compare with Islamic thinking? Well, unlike the Bible that restricts the scope of head coverings to the context of praying or prophesying within corporate worship, an Islamic woman's head covering, must be worn at all times, with the exception of among immediate family and slaves, provided that any of those male slaves have no sexual needs or desires. Quran 24:31. I'll let you read the whole thing, but this is where you find the list of exceptions where a woman can take off her head covering, and says that the women should draw their veils over their bosoms, not display their beauty, except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women or slaves whom their right hand possesses, or male slaves free of physical needs, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex. So those are the exceptions, which is really kind of interesting to me because it seems to focus primarily on men and seems to exclude her nuclear family, her parents and whatnot. But in any case, those are the people that can see Muslim women without their head coverings. Okay, but why? Unlike the Bible that says a woman's head covering is a symbol of power, the Quran makes it clear that a Muslim woman's covering is a symbol of Islamic identity to protect her sexual purity. And we see this in Quran 33:59, which says, O Prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such and not molested. And Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Okay, but how does a fashion covering protect a woman's sexual purity? Well, the Islamic sources make it clear that it does this in at least two ways. Number one, a Muslim woman's covering is supposed to protect her from sexual assaults from Islamic men. I'm only going to read the relevant parts here because there's a lot of citations, but again, you can find the links below of the full citation. So this is Quran 23, 1 through 6, that says that the believers must eventually win. Who is winning? Those who abstain from sex, except those joined to them in the marriage bond, or the captives whom their right hand possesses. This idea is echoed in Quran 70, 29 through 35, that says that those who guard their chastity, except with their wives and their captives whom their right hand possesses, and such will be honored ones in the garden of bliss. So, last example here, Quran 4:24 says you're forbidden to marry married women except your slave girls. This is a decree of God. So Allah has made it very clear that it is not immoral for an Islamic man to take women as sex slaves. And the Quran is very consistent in this testimony, and that it is perfectly moral for Islamic men to capture and subjugate an unlimited number of women as sex slaves. And the first two verses I cited are Meccan examples, which establishes that this principle is true in times of peace, as much as the last Medinan surah is, which establishes that capturing women as a sex slave is permissible, even if the woman is already married. Now, that last one seems to shock a lot of male Christian apologists because it does provide a moral loophole for adultery. But as a woman potentially at risk of being forced into sex slavery, technical adultery that derives from my marital status is really the least of my moral concerns when we're talking about sex slavery and being subjected to being a sex slave. But it does show that the Islamic principle of sex slavery absolutely does not respect other men's headship rights to a wife's sexuality to such a degree that non-Islamic complementarian marriages have the same level of theological respect as women do, which is virtually none. But keeping the focus on the Islamic women's fashion theology, these surahs make it abundantly clear that there was a dire need, a logistical need for Islamic men who were morally free to seize sex slaves to be able to quickly and easily distinguish Islamic women from non-Islamic women so that they didn't inadvertently take the wife or the daughter of another Islamic man captive as a sex slave. So while a Christian head covering functioned like an authoritative hat, not unlike what one might wear only at work, such as like an old-fashioned nurse or a fireman, etc. It's a hat you wear when you're at work. In this case, it would be for women in the ministry job of praying or prophesying while they're at church. The Islamic head covering is first and foremost a functional gang sign that is designed to identify members to each other in order to protect the members from a form of friendly fire known as sex slavery. That being the case, devout Muslim women who are not under compulsion or duress to wear Islamic head covering fashions, but they do so willingly and of their own free will, are morally complicit in the sanctioning of devout Islamic men targeting women, kafir women, who do not comply with the Islamic fashions as potential victims for Islamic theologically sanctioned sex slavery. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, an Islamic woman's head covering is supposed to protect Islamic women from sexual assaults from any man with sexual lust outside of her immediate family. Again, I want to remind you, Quran 24:31 already established that there are relationships with men that can handle being in the presence of a woman's beauty uncovered without seeing her as a sex object. So that lack of sexual depravity will protect a woman, but only within her immediate family or slaves that have no sexual desire for her. But outside of those exceptions, which are listed in the perfectly clear and preserved Quran, a Muslim woman needs to cover to protect and safeguard her sexual purity from assault from any man. There are several reliable Islamic commentaries of Quran 33:59 which confirm this, which again you can read in the links below. But here's one representative example from Ibn al-Kathir, where it's a command to the believing women. I'll just read the whole thing. Here, Allah tells his messenger to command the believing women, especially his wives and daughters, because of their position of honor, to draw their jibabs over their bodies so that they will be distinct in their appearance from the women of the Jahiliyyah and from slave women. So this makes it clear that the fashion for the early Muslim women was indistinguishable from how women dressed prior to the revelation of the Quran, when that period is known as the Jahiliyyah. And early Muslim women, whether single or married, were also indistinguishable from how the women who were subjugated as sex slaves looked. So that means that the women who were taken as sex slaves did not dress promiscuously. They were indistinguishable, all these categories of women. Had these women that were taken as sex slaves dressed in a promiscuous manner or in a manner that was distinct, there would be no need for Muslim women to adopt a fashion so as to distinguish them from the women that were taken as sex slaves. Nonetheless, the Quran still puts the onus on fashion that covers a woman's body to protect her sexual honor. Therefore, Islamic fashion theology sports a victim-blaming logical train behind it that reasons that if a woman is ever sexually assaulted, raped, or taken captive as a sex slave, Quran 33:59 implicitly states that that is because her fashion was asking for it. And this is why Ibn al-Kathir stressed that the distinctive fashion was especially important to protect the honor of any wife or daughter belonging to the most honored of all the Islamic prophets, Muhammad. But I will take it a step further and say that the Islamic covering can even protect the honor of a Muslim husband. And I say this because although Quran 4:34 commands husbands to exercise a three-step progressive discipline procedure that culminates in corporal punishment, and Razi's commentary at Tafsir al-Kabir makes it clear that this Quran verse was specifically handed down in response to a husband slapping his wife on the face so hard that her face was still marked by the hit. Even though that's the context, there is still shame for a Muslim husband who leaves evidence of physical abuse on a woman's face. But thank Allah for the Islamic fashions like the niquab and the burka, so that if a husband does leave evidence of physical abuse on a woman's face and he's ashamed about how that might make him look, these injuries can be easily concealed to protect his reputation. And in fact, Sahih al-Bukhari even suggests that Islamic coverings might be accessorized to match and possibly camouflage physical injuries so well that Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, the mother of the faithful, boldly declared that she has not seen any woman suffer as much as Muslim women. And you see this in Sahih al-Bukhari 58:25. I'm just going to read the relevant portion where it says, Aisha said that the lady came wearing a green veil and complained to Aisha of her husband and showed her a green spot on her skin caused by beating. And Aisha said, I have not seen any woman suffer as much as the believing woman. Look, her skin is greener than her clothes. So apparently her clothes were the same color as her bruise. This bruise had to be pointed out. It was not obvious, and that is because it was veiled. And then on top of that, it was in a similar color hue as the veil itself, which made it even harder to spot. It had to be pointed out, and the women had to support each other in that. Didn't end up helping, though, because in the end, we know that Muhammad ended up siding with the husband. So that's that. In conclusion, at worst, the Christian head coverings are theologically associated with shaved heads, functional idolatry of male headship, and or possibly idolatry of fashion-conscious angels at church. But at best, they are associated with hair, power, prayer, and prophesying at church. In contrast, at worst, Islamic coverings for women, albeit a hijab, chador, niquab, or burka, are associated with sex slavery everywhere except among close family, which I don't know why all of a sudden they would have self-control, but no one else does, but that's okay. At worst, the Islamic coverings are associated with sex slavery everywhere except among close family and select slaves, associated with victim blaming and possible complicity or cover-up of domestic violence. And at best, the Islamic head coverings, or coverings, I should say, because it's not necessarily the head, just the head, it's associated with Islamic identity, sexual purity, but that comes with a codependent empowerment of slave owners and traders that target kafirs for sex trafficking, or people that do not don the Islamic garb. So that is quite a vast contrast there, to go from praying and prophesying at church to sex, slavery, and domestic violence. So what are your thoughts on this? Let me know. And in the meantime, I want to thank you very much for your time in considering these things. I really do hope that by seeing the two different worldviews, we can spot where idolatry has crept into the traditions of Christianity, so that we can expose it and have nothing to do with it, so that our focus is on Jesus Christ and not gender hierarchies within the church. So with that said, I want to thank you very much for your time. I hope you're going to join me next week. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great week. God bless.